Hi, I'm Bettejane Bolan-Kenney, Associate Professor in the English Department here at Brookdale Community College and Coordinator of Novel Brookdale, an interdisciplinary initiative to promote reading and learning across campus through novels. This is Brookdale's Visiting Writers Series, and I'm here with Edward P. Jones, winner of the 2004 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction for his novel, The Known World. Hello, Edward. Thanks so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
I've had the opportunity to discuss the known world with a wide range of people across our campus community. And the question that has come up nearly every time is how you became interested in black slave owners as a subject for fiction.
Well, I didn't really become interested. I learned that there were black slave owners when I was in college. And several decades later, after I had finished the first book I wrote, I was looking around for something else to do. And I recall that one fact. It wasn't a book that I read it in, it wasn't a lecture. As far as I can remember, it may well have been a footnote. And over several weeks, over several months, images and all came to me, and I began to fashion this novel. My first thought was that I would read these 40 or so books that I had on American slavery. And that never worked out, and so I simply relied on what I knew about the world back then, and also relied on my imagination. So it comes, I hate to say that subjects sort of pick you, but sometimes that's the case. I mean, you wake up in the morning with a certain image, and I suppose one of the first images I had was of the primary character, Henry Townsend, dying in the first pages of the book, dying very young, as a matter of fact, even young for a 19th century person.
You've mentioned not doing an extensive amount of research on the subject and relying on imagination to craft this novel. Was there any background reading that you did as you were working on it?
No. I had one book, it's called The Negro in Virginia, about slavery at that time. And I read about 40 pages of that, 91, 92, after I completed the first book. And I found it wasn't so much that it was dry. I think I just, what I've often likened it to is that the two sections of the brain, one, this logical section that said you have to read all those books because, you were not around in the 19th century, and so you have to know something what the world looked like. There's also that creative part of the brain that sort of says fiction should come out of the imagination. I've read, I'm sure you have too, far more than I have, books where the author has done tons of research and felt compelled to plow that research into the work of fiction. So that what happens is that the research often takes center stage, and the characters are off to the side. And I think I didn't really know this. I think perhaps my creative brain knew that. And that's why year after year I would pick up the same book, The Negro in Virginia, and I'd read those same pages. And at the same point, more or less, every year, I would have to stop because I just wasn't into it. I mean, I realized I would never, I'm not a historian, I suppose, and the creative part of my brain knew that.
Well, and what's so fascinating and compelling about the known world is the people that inhabit it. And obviously relying on, creative ideas and imagination to create those characters wouldn't require, the kinds of research that you're describing to just pack pages with historical information.
Yeah, the section that I'll read this evening has to do with this woman who's a teacher who owns slaves. She's a black woman, and this fellow that she buys. And one of the things that when I read that and people ask me the first thing about research, is that I tell them that the little section that I read is about the interaction between this man and this woman. And there's very little in it to tell you that it's 1855 Virginia and everything else. There's a serai, there are horses, there are men with guns, and it's obvious, of course, that it's a time of slavery. But I've already told the reader in the early pages of the novel that it's 1855 Virginia, and the reader will flow along with me all the way until I say something 20th century or 21st century, and the effect is broken. So you can get away with a whole lot of things.
Yeah, I think that you're right, and I think that the novel holds together, as complex as it is, it holds together so well because of all those believable characters and believable threads that you've pulled together. While we're on the subject of history and historical fiction, we've been having a number of conversations about what makes this novel different, what sets it apart as an example of historical fiction. And one thing is that you have created some of the historical backgrounds that you offer. You offer census records and some historical documents, and even the names of historians, books that they've written, but you've fictionalized that aspect as well. Why did you decide to take that approach, to add that, that background information?
Well, for 10 years, I'd put off all the reading and just read those 40 or so pages. So after 10 years, the reading had not been done. Also, one thing I was also going to do was visit a friend that I'd gone to graduate school with. He lives in Lynchburg, south of Charlottesville, where we'd gone to school. And my intention was that we would, spend a Saturday driving around this pickup truck, and then I would use the setting of his county for the novel. And over those 10 years, I never got around to doing that as well. So at the very last moment, actually, I was faced with the world of people, characters, a plot, a beginning, a middle, and end, and I did not have this real county. So I made it my own. I mean, I plucked out of the air this name Manchester County because that sounded rather British.
Yeah.
And in order for me, I would have had no trouble if I don't know what Kim's County is called, whether it's Lynchburg County or not. But there would have been no trouble with that because it does exist. My county, of course, is out of my imagination.
Yes.
And so I have to do everything that I can to have the reader believe that it's real. And so I just went and looked at my memory, and I remember the census is every 10 years, and that the census has gone back to the 18th century. Originally, I had worked it out that there would be these 3 books in the 21st century about this county. And at first, the fictional authors, they had no names. And there were people that I acknowledged in the acknowledgement section. And there were 3 other people that I thought a lot of that I could not fit into the acknowledgement section. That section, the acknowledgement section, is very short. Some people write books and they give 3-4 pages to the acknowledgements. The dairyman, the butcher.
Right.
I did not want to do that. It sort of lessened the people you put in that. So there were 3 people that I could not fit into that section. So I called my friends up, including Kim in Lynchburg, and I said, can I use your name as the author of a history book on this imaginary county? And he said, yes. I remember he said, be something to tell the grandchildren. He doesn't have any children, so I don't know what he was talking about. But so yeah, it was a fact that I had to make Manchester as real as possible. And lo and behold, in the course of thinking this through, I found a way to sort of kill the county off, as it were.
Yes.
So it must seem real, and yet there's a really good explanation for why it's not around anymore. I realized as well down the line that had I used Kim's County, I would have been forever plagued by people who pop up in an audience and say, well, me and my generations have lived in Manchester, lived in Lynchburg County forever. And on page such and such, you say this. Well, no one could ever do that.
That's right. And so there's no crossing that boundary for, history versus fiction.
Yeah.
I said to you before we started the interview that as a literature professor, my students often ask me, why does an author do this or that when we're studying a given text? And, the only thing I can do is point them back to the text to look for the answers to whatever questions they have. And that this is a wonderful opportunity for me because I've got the author here and I can ask. But it sounds from what you've been saying like it's relying on that inspiration that comes with creativity, relying on the imagination, and that mostly that's the answer that I can give to my students.
Yeah.
Why does the author do this or that? Because this was part of his or her creative process.
Yeah.
This was a choice that he or she made as part of the imaginative process of creating whatever piece of art they're creating.
Yeah, that moment, and one particular day you get up and you turn on the computer, and it's time to write. And all the things that you are up until that very moment, that very morning, they proceed to create for that particular day. Sometimes the answer is there, of course, and sometimes not. I mean, there are things that I'm beginning to realize as I go along that I may have done differently here and there. And even with all the revisions that I did, once I did get around to the physical act of writing, there's a page, not in the hardcover, not in the paperback, but in the hardcover, where, and I'll read that section, but not the mistake. John Skiffington, the sheriff of this place, he gets into the carriage with his wife, and 5, 6, 7, 8 lines later, he does the same thing again. Now, I went over that again and again and again, and all the people in New York went over it again and again.
Right.
No one noticed that happened. And it's just, an imperfection on one particular day. And it happened again and again, as far as I'm concerned. When I did all the revisions, I just did not see him do that.
How much of the creative process of putting this novel together involved revision work as opposed to crafting the original draft of the narrative?
Well, I revised as much as I possibly could, and you just do it and do it and do it until you sort of get tired and you're at the 15th revision and the people don't say or do anything different from the 14th.
Exactly.
And so maybe it's time to move on. And I think, it's because I started writing it the last part of December 2001, and by June I had done enough revisions that I felt comfortable sending it to my agent in New York. But even after that, even after there was a woman became my editor, Dawn Davis, I still revised and revised again and again. It's just, people are imperfect, and so whatever you make is imperfect, and I'm always aware of that.
Okay.
So I did it until they said, hey, no more.
Time to stop. Yeah. Okay, we're going to take a break. I'm Bettejane Bolan-Kenney, and this is the Brookdale Visiting Writer Series. Please stay tuned for more of our conversation with Edward Jones.
Hello, my name is Max Weinberg, and I'm a musician, but most importantly, I'm a parent. I'd like to speak to you today about a subject that's very important to me, and I know, of course, that it's important to you, our children. To best understand the challenges that our children face every day, well, I'm going to ask you to go back in time and remember the challenges that you faced as a child. How did you handle the bully in the locker room? How did you handle being left out of the group in the cafeteria? Do you remember who first tried to get you to smoke a cigarette, or try a beer, or a joint? How did you handle peer pressure? These are just a few of the challenges that your child faces every day in their young lives. How did you know what the right choice was? Prevention First is a nonprofit agency in Monmouth County that offers educational programs dedicated to strengthening the foundation of our children's lives.
How can you pursue your associate's, bachelor's, or master's degree close to home? Through the New Jersey Coastal Communiversity. The Communiversity is an alliance of 8 universities and colleges offering courses and programs right here at the Brookdale campus at Wall. To find out more, call 732-224-2609. That's 732-224-2609. Or visit our website at www.njcommuniversity.org.
Hi, we're back. I'm Bettejane Bolan-Kenney of the Brookdale English Department, and I'm speaking with Edward P. Jones, Pulitzer Prize Winning author of The Known World. Edward, thanks again for being with us today. I saw an interview you did for the Jim Lehrer NewsHour in which you talked about a college writing course you took and a professor who said wonderful things about your writing. Many of our students here at Brookdale are here because they're trying to find their path, figure out, what they want to do. So I'm wondering if you could comment a little bit about what your college experience was like. What were your career plans at that time?
Well, I think I was more or less floundering. I didn't think about the writing thing until probably years after I'd gone to college. I think at one point I was thinking about journalism and perhaps law. So what I advise students always is try to take as many courses as you possibly can. And even if someone says, well, this guy, he gives hard grades, impossible to get anything but a C. You simply have to dive in, because we're talking about the rest of your life, not just, the transcript, the grade on the transcript. So I took the writing course when I was a sophomore, but it still wasn't, part of my makeup to think that I could be a writer. So it's, I continued doing it off and on after college, and that's been the case for me over the years. I've never been one to get up every morning and write.
What happened that changed that view of yourself, though, that you were able to see yourself as a writer and begin to write the things that you wanted to write?
Well, I wrote a story in the mid-1970s that was ultimately published. And then I went on to graduate school to get a Master of Fine Arts in creative writing, and that helped a lot. And I, had more stories published. And then for quite a while there, especially during the 1980s, there wasn't much doing. And then I finally got around to finishing this collection of stories that I had in mind, and that was accepted. And so I went on from there. But I'm not really sure that I get up every morning and think of myself as a writer. It's still something that, a small group of people out in the world do, that can afford to do it.
What's been the most surprising part for you then about winning the Pulitzer Prize and what comes with an award like that?
Well, I think just winning it, given the enormous number of books that are published every year, and some fine writers, they publish books and no one ever hears about them, and that's unfortunate. So to be plucked out, to be recognized, is rather phenomenal, and I'm still amazed by it.
I want to turn our attention to some specific questions that readers across campus have had about the book. You mentioned earlier that you started with this image of the main character. He dies in the opening chapter, and this sort of image of him on his deathbed. And it struck me, I've read the book several times, and as I said, I've had lots of opportunity to talk to people about it, increase my understanding and appreciation of it. But it struck me even the first time that I read it that you represent death in the novel as a going home. When Augustus dies, he imagines himself, walking very quickly back home to be with his wife. And when Mildred dies, she imagines herself checking on her son and then getting into bed next to her husband. So there's a sense of death as going home. And then I went back and thought about this key death that sort of sets the novel into motion, and it's Henry's. I want to just read you this passage and get your thoughts on it. This is Henry's death scene. Henry walked up the steps and into the tiniest of houses, knowing with each step that he did not own it, that he was only renting. He was ever so disappointed. He heard footsteps behind him, and Death told him it was Caldonia, coming to register her own disappointment. Whoever was renting the house to him had promised 1,000 rooms, but as he traveled through the house, he found less than 4 rooms, and all the rooms were identical, and his head touched their ceilings. This will not do, Henry kept saying to himself, and he turned to share that thought with his wife, to say, wife, look what they done. And God told him right then, not a wife, Henry, but a widow. Henry's death, as I said, it sets the events of the novel into motion, but it feels like you've represented his journey to death differently.
Well, I think there are two groups of people. There are those who tried very hard to do the best they could, and Henry is not one of them. And there are people who tried to do the best they could, and it turned out that it was fine, which is the case with his mother and father, which is why their deaths are rather easy and peaceful. Right. Because they had earned them. They had earned them. Henry did not earn that. The same thing with the sheriff. He, despite having a good heart, failed because ultimately he is the law when it comes to upholding this whole system.
Yes.
And he has to be punished for that. And, it's not as if I looked down upon everyone and said, you this, it was, what could I do logically
Right.
to have things work themselves out? And when I looked at the sheriff, when I looked at John Skeffington, I felt that was the kind of death he deserved. I'd wanted to do a lot more of that, but what happens is the imagination sometimes fails you. So there's some other character in there I think that happens too, but I can't remember. I wanted to have this sort of connection between people and houses.
Yeah. One faculty member, a nursing faculty member, who came to one of the discussions, pointed out when we were talking about this idea of representing death, in terms of houses and the idea of going home. She said that there's a belief that is communicated in the Yiddish language that your piece of heaven gets smaller in relation to what kind of life you live. And that applies perfectly here, that Henry's piece of heaven wasn't quite as big as he was expecting that it would be.
Yeah, 1,000 rooms as opposed to 4 rooms.
Right.
Yeah, he didn't, Augustus said and I think the good people, as it were, and not everyone is good all the way through the book, but the good people in a certain sense, they would not want 1,000 rooms.
Right.
Augustus might want 4 and be comfortable with that. But it's a sign of the kind of person that Henry was, that he wanted more and more and more. And even though he had a whole lot, that great deal did not do him.
While we're on the subject of, death and the afterlife and, piece of heaven, I want to ask you about the presence of spiritual beliefs in the novel, ideas about faith, because many characters throughout the novel comment on the presence or intention of God. Why is God intending things to happen the way they do? What information is God going to give me so that I can make this decision? How conscious were you of building those, ideas about spiritual faith into the novel?
Well, I was very conscious because I realized, of course, I was dealing with people in the mid-19th century, and most of those people would have been religious, whether they were slave or free.
Right.
So I'm not a religious person whatsoever, but I often say that I've been doomed to write about people who are. So I could not write a novel about people in America, in the South at that time, without including religion. I mean, people were on various rungs of the religious ladder. Some were at the top, like Skeffington, and some were at the very bottom. I think maybe Celeste would have been religious. I don't think her husband is, Elias.
Yeah.
So no, I could not, write the truth, even though everything is fiction, without including that.
Speaking of Elias, and for me, he's one of the characters in the novel that has really stuck with me, somebody that I've thought about quite a bit after reading the book. He's one example of the idea in the novel that art is a way to survive, art is a way to transcend. It goes from, small examples of him sort of whittling the doll and needing this to keep his hands busy. Henry and Augustus both have creative ability that sort of provides opportunity and sets them apart. And of course you end the book with Alice and the art that she creates in order to try to represent the complexity of the slave situation on the Townsend plantation, but also this period in American history. To what extent does art figure prominently as a thread in the novel, or do you see art as a way out of, or a way to interpret or understand difficult situations?
Yeah, I think people, it may not just necessarily be art by itself. I think for me, a lot of the people who manage to get to what I call the other side, like Alice, and of course Elias wants to be free, but that's not open to him at that time. But I think that those on one side, those people who were given the world and made something and decided, well, I won't accept just this little bit of the world that they've given to me, which is what Elias does. Had he continued on this road of wanting to be free and wanting to run away, I think eventually he'd been killed.
Right.
But to his own surprise, he falls in love with this woman who's crippled and therefore cannot run away. And they have a family, and that is their way
Yes.
to getting to the other side. I think for Augustus, it's the same sort of way. You know, we're all given these horrible situations in life at times, and if we have enough things to grab onto, the pity, the sorrow of the world is that, you know, there is perhaps somewhere in Africa, somewhere in India, somewhere in China, somebody, you know, is suffering, and that maybe if they had the ability to write a poem once a day, then that might help them.
Yeah.
You know, or paint a picture. And so it's art in some cases, and in other cases, like with Elias, it's family.
Yes.
And with Stanford, for example, this another slave who has spent his whole life chasing women and one day decides to kill himself. And he's redeemed in this tiny, tiny way by realizing that the way out of this is to care about other human beings. So, yeah, I think it's art, but it's something much larger than that. Art is just one of the things we grab hold of.
Yeah, and again, that idea of creating as a way to express and understand and you know.
Yeah, it makes you part of the world, and it makes the world a little easier to accept.
Yes. Okay, that's all we have time for today. Thanks for joining us for Brookdale's Visiting Writers Series. And Edward, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks a lot.